Hello, everybody, and welcome to the September 2022 Integration Down Under. It has been a while since we have been here, but as like everything else lately, everybody has been busy and busy. So that's my excuse at least. So we'll we'll go with that. So we'll go through the organizers quickly. We've got Martin, Dan. Oh, actually, this is an old slide. Sorry about this. That should say Mick Badrin instead of Renee. Sorry, Mick.
That's all right, Bill.
I pulled an old slide. Wagner and myself. So Mick's on the call tonight. So yeah. But basically, these are the organizers. Martin has been that busy too lately, but he has had time for some holidays. I know I've got one more day to work and then I'm off for 10 days. So this is I'm getting this squeezed in before I get gone on a holiday. First real holiday I've had since COVID. So it should be good. So a little bit about myself, but we're not going to spend much time on that. So what we're going to talk about tonight is looking at the great Azure integration question, or at least my topic of that. Just quickly, I'm going to flip it to where it's just the presentation that's on there. The rest of the guys can mute their microphones if they want to, but they're still into the thing. I'm just showing the presentation instead of showing the pictures. So for me, the more and more that things are developing around the logic apps, both consumption and standard and function apps, all the different .NET cores and things like that. One of the main questions I'm getting from customers and from other developers is, what do I use? What do I use? When do I use it? Things like that. So I thought this is not going to be the end all of that discussion. This is probably going to be a more start to that discussion than an end. But at least I'll go through a few of the ideas and a few of the reasonings behind it. Because one of the things that I've heard from customers is that Azure integration, there's not really a single product. And that causes some issues because they look at things like Dell Boomi or MuleSoft or Tibco, any of those other products. There's a product that does all the stuff. If you look under the covers, most of those products have lots of pieces, but they are a single product that is there. But with Azure integration, there are multiple pieces that we need. And so there's a little bit about myself, and kind of the agenda I want to cover is kind of just a little bit of general information, why there's a choice, a little bit on how to choose. I've got a couple of little demos in there also, so we'll have a look at that, and then a little bit of a summary. So with integration, there's always more than one way to do things. And one of the biggest things I know for the guys that are in this group and helping me with this group is that with BizTalk, one of the classic things was the prime competitor to BizTalk usually wasn't another product. It was actually the developers going out and building the integrations themselves. So because of the price point for BizTalk, it was like, okay, we're going to do a standard instance of BizTalk for 10 or 12 grand, or we're going to go spend 150,000 on Tibco. So you kind of got the price point was the only thing. And then it was more developers going out and building things themselves. And I mean, this kind of applies today also, because you think about logic apps and you think about functions. Functions are really that developers doing most of it themselves, or just even basic web API. So, and again, this is the kind of some of the questions I get from customers is that there's not a single product. I tend to start referring to a lot of the integration focused components in Azure as Azure integration services. So logic apps, service bus, API management, those type of tools kind of lumped into that, because typically my integration solutions include logic apps, function apps, API management, service bus, key vault, app config, log analytics, all of those pieces that we get. And one of the things I remember from a long time ago is that back when the program group from Microsoft was working on moving BizTalk to Azure, there was always this discussion around, did it need to look like BizTalk or was it something different? The first set of BizTalk services kind of had that same kind of pipeline structure as BizTalk had, with that validate, enrich, transform, and route. And it was very XML centric. But I can remember talking to them at the time, and they got a lot of kickback from Scott Guthrie. If you're familiar with Scott, he is Mr. Azure kind of in Microsoft. Everybody that's doing things in Azure pretty much reports up to him at some point. And he really didn't want another kind of siloed product. He wanted something that every group could use, so they could use across that cross section of Azure. And again, if we start looking at the event grid is a real classic example of that, because you can get events from a lot of different things in Azure, and then you can process them with logic apps, function apps, whatever you want to process them with, even web API. So again, that's the kind of the thinking you have to have around why there's so many different ways to do things in Azure. So this is going to be the main part of the talk tonight, is going to be this table. Feel free, guys, to unmute yourself if you want to make some comments on this too. Also, you can, I'm going to just post a comment in. If you have questions, you can post into the YouTube Live. And they will come up here, Bill, on my screen. What's that?
I'll keep an eye out for those.
Okay, yep. So if you have questions there, I guess the one thing that I get a lot of is purely by a cost basis. So, and a lot of this is around being a Microsoft partner. We can get some funding from Microsoft for integration projects, but when we start adding up how much, and it's typically based on an ROI, and it's like 10% of how much they're going to spend. But when you start looking at Logic Apps consumption, because it's basically all a per action, you don't have a lot of spend there. So you don't tend to get a lot of money that way. There is a different flavor of the Logic App consumption, which is and this is kind of taking the Mickey out of it. I got $E, which it's ISE, which is the integrated service environment. And that basically allows you to run your consumption-based Logic Apps inside of a VNet, so they can get access to all of your data inside of your VNets, and then through ExpressRoute or a VPN down to your on-premise data. But I think last time I checked, it was about, I think the minimum ISE configuration was about $7,500 a month. So that kind of defeats the purpose of that per action consumption Logic App that may cost you $1 if you were running it outside of an ISE. With the release of Logic App Standard, you have a workflow, or they don't really call it a workflow app service plan, but it's an app service plan that works with the Logic App Standard. And basically it is a premium service, so it allows a lot of those premium features that you would see in like the function app plans. You can also run it in an ASE version 3. An ASE version 3 is the latest generation of the ASE, much cheaper and much easier than the original versions of ASE. And your function app basically has a little bit more flexibility. So you can run it in a function app consumption-based plan, which you pay for what you use. You can run it in a premium function service plan, so like an EP1. You can run it in a normal app service plan alongside of your website. And you can run it in a app service environment version 3. So function app's got the most flexibility. And I don't know if I've
Bill, and I think if I could just sort of jump in here as well,
yep.
I think you touched on some really good points in the sense that customers have a lot of different options for how they want to position their integration. So whether they're going to go on logic apps or function apps or roll their own or, whatever that looks like. Now, in our world here, we've got, let's say, logic apps, which per action is fractions of cents. And, on a consumption plan. And there really comes a point, and there's a really sort of very measured and considered step that you need to do, which is sizing or pricing of this, because, they're almost orders of magnitude different. However, on consumption plans, if you get really busy, it makes perfect sense to go on to, something with more predictable pricing, such as Logic App Standard or, one of the function apps, non-consumption options. And, so as you're saying that some of those at the top end, some of them sort of come in at $7.5K. If you're really busy, then that's a great result, because that environment can scale and you've got capping on on a lot of that integration that you're doing. Where it gets mismatched is, let's say you're not that busy and you're sort of building up the practice or building up the capability. It becomes a real art form to sort of see, well, just exactly what is the right hosting model for you.
Yeah, and it was interesting because the feedback I got when they put out the ISE was not the feedback I expected from Europe. The European guys loved it. They wanted it because they had really big Logic App consumption users, and they were trying to compete against some of the other products, and they were spending $10,000 a month, where ISE dropped that cost by almost a quarter when they brought ISE in. But in Australia, we just didn't see that because everybody was doing smaller scale pieces. So again, it really depends on how you're using it. One of the things I try to do with my customers is that I try to set up their environments in such a way that they can share the Logic App Standard app service plans between multiple standard Logic apps. So that kind of, the first one they do is expensive, but the third, fourth, fifth, sixth, like that, the price comes down and they're sharing that cost. So that helps a lot.
It's worth noting too that in the Logic App Standard, for example, to go from consumption to standard, it's only a couple of $100. It's in the hundreds of dollars as opposed to the thousands. And so, as you're saying, that's a great step up because you've got predictable pricing. You can reuse it across several other projects. Now, if they, flatline or ceiling, max out the CPU or whatever it might be, then you've got options to scale those. So, not everything sort of, as soon as you go from consumption, jumps you to sort of, your $7,000. But there are some really good ways to work up towards an enterprise capability.
Yep.
Yeah.
And again, go ahead.
Just thinking about the point that you make, Mika, it gives you the elasticity, right? So I use the extra when I have to, but I have kept most of the time, right? And it is even up to you to say, do I really want to cap? Because you have the ability or the knobs to say, I only want that one instance running all the time, or I want one instance running most of the time. But if I having a peak, I don't want my customers to suffer for that. I think it's something that became really apparent after we moved from a bespoke kind of environment or a server-based environment to Azure, is that cost became a design decision as well, which is something that most of us were not accustomed at before. We are like sizing servers, and then you're taking like you beat that server to death. Right. Yep. Now you needed to use that because the elasticity is the kind of a double-edged sword. You can use it to really improve your performance, but also can become like a lot of cost.
And I guess that kind of moves on nicely to the next topic, which is kind of hosting. Whether it's you're in a multi-tenant environment or whether you're in kind of that single-tenant environment. Because that was a lot of the questions that I got with Logic Apps originally, was some people were a little bit uncomfortable with that multi-tenant environment of the Logic Apps consumption, because basically you deploy your Logic App, but it's running in at multi-tenant in runtime. You sometimes got a little bit less than optimal performance. Sometimes if a lot of people were busy in that particular region that you were in, you did get some performance things. I didn't see it as much with Logic Apps, but I saw it more with like Service Bus and things like that, that it was also a multi-tenanted type service. But that's the difference there on that hosting model, is that basically whatever you're using in terms of your app service plan in your standard or your function apps, you're using all of that. You don't have to worry about what's happening in the rest of the region that might affect that as much. So, and again, that was some of the questions we got from customers was around that. The storage account required, this also comes into play a little bit. Okay. And now it's not something that you think of immediately, but if you think about your Logic Apps, and you'll notice that you get that history information recorded from every action that's executed. And that information is stored out there for you to go look at. When you go to standard, that information is stored in your storage account that you create when you create your Logic App standard. And if you have lots and lots of stuff happening, you can bump those storage costs. And they do have is it gone GA yet for the piece where you can point to SQL for that?
I need to double check that, Bill. I know that there was a revamp on that, and there is like a new public preview coming again soon with some updates on that. Yeah.
So there is some workarounds for that, but that is something to keep in mind. It's probably more on your mind if you're running standard and you've got a bunch of little Logic Apps that run, say, every minute and start kicking out all of that storage. You're going to see that storage account grow and things like that. The next one is actually the one that we ran into early on with Logic Apps. And I'm not sure about you guys, but we ran into this one because they wanted to put the Logic Apps inside of a VNet to protect them from the outside world. But the Logic Apps consumption really, there's no option with that except when they release the ISE. But again, it was a consumption app that was costing you $5 a week, and all of a sudden it's a Logic app that's costing you $7,500 a month. And I mean, VNet integration, we saw this even in the app service plans, because you had to go to standard or premium app service plans for a website when you wanted VNet integration. So we saw this before, and with the Logic apps consumption, you have that now. That's one of the advantages of the Logic App Standard and that app service, the workflow app service plan, is that those are premium plans that have that VNet integration capabilities and things like that inside of the plan. And that applies to both the plans for Logic App Standard and the Function App Premium plans, or the higher tier app service plans that have that VNet integration. And you can, with the next one, which kind of molds into this same topic, which is the private endpoints, you can connect your Logic App Standard or your Function app through the premium app service plans into the VNet with private endpoints. You can then set settings that force all of that traffic to go through that private endpoint, so that you really don't expose your Function app or your Logic App Standard to the outside world. And that private endpoints is kind of that middle ground between being in the internet or being inside of a VNet. So that basically gives you a little bit more capabilities, because there may just be certain things you need to reach into the VNet for. So if you need to reach in, I need to go to a SQL database that's on premise that's inside the VNet, I can do that with a private endpoint.
And Bill, if I can jump in here for a moment, from a practical example, recently 2 customers wanted ISO 27001 compliance with their cloud footprint, with what they're doing, in their Logic apps, and how they're handling integration and the data and encryption at rest and all these sorts of things. And if you know about that standard, then it's quite laborious and there's a lot to it. So it's verbose, and it's hard to then equate back to, well, if I turn this on, what effect does that have in the standard, in the ISO standard? And so, and the reason why I bring this up is because 2 customers came along. Now, in Azure, Defender for the cloud is amazing. It comes along, and basically as a SaaS service, you can come along and configure Defender to incorporate the ISO 27001 policy. It will then go out to your integration footprint, your resource groups, your subscriptions, VMs, whatever you might have, databases, and then report back on them and say, well, found all these problems. And then it also equates back to where that is in the ISO standard and what the remediation is to do. And a lot of them are, let's go and use private endpoints to lock down these Logic apps and Function apps and so on. And so it ends up being a really critical piece if compliance to these policies is important to you. And I just thought it was heaven sent, because trying to match everything up and think that you're doing the best thing is, we all follow best practices, like security best practices and everything else. And this was a real way of just providing that missing link of validation between what we do as security best practices, getting things on private endpoints and VNets and so forth, versus here's a standard, an industry standard that we want to adhere to.
So I hear you've just volunteered to do a talk on Defender.
That's exactly what I understood, Bill.
Yeah.
That would be a really good topic.
I'll do that.
Yeah.
So
talking about VNet integration and private endpoints is something that a lot of people still find it a little bit of a mystery, right? And trying to understand which is which. But the way that I always thought about is like from the resource point of view, in this case from the Logic Apps standard, or from the function app point of view, anything that is going out from the app into other resources is going to be governed by VNet integration. So VNet integration gives you outbound connectivity through a virtual network, while everything that is coming into the resource, or in this case, like again, the Logic Apps or the function app, is going to be governed by the private endpoint. So when you're thinking about, do I need to reach something inside the VNet, you needed to configure and making sure that your VNet integration is set up properly. I need anything from my virtual network to access the components, but not on the public internet. That's where you're going to be setting up the private endpoints. So it's a good thing to bear in mind. And I really like the way that they improved the portal now to show that difference. They have like the inbound and the outbound, and showing that makes much more explicit. That was not explicit before.
And the IP addresses as well. So your IP ranges and things like that.
Show exactly what you're dealing with. Like, are you dealing with internal IP, external IPs, and show exactly where you are.
Yeah, that was the interesting one when I saw private endpoints show up for API management. I was going, oh, wow, we can do that with basic and not, or with standard instead of going premium. Yeah. But it's only for things that are inside of your VNet trying to hit API management without going to the public internet. Mm-hmm. It's not for API management to reach into your VNet to run a service that's inside of your VNet.
Yeah, so that's still going to require VNet integration. And
at I realize that
VNet integration is just on premium.
Yeah. So yeah, there probably is another whole talk around VNet and private endpoints. Especially in this integration space, but at least we've kind of got a little bit of that discussion started. And then one of the big battles I have been fighting with my developers at 6Pivot has been, we don't like Logic Apps consumption because we can't test everything locally. Has anybody else heard that?
Yeah.
So that's the one thing that we have gained by that Logic App Standard and Function Apps. They both have the ability to spin up that runtime locally on your machine and be able to set breakpoints and do debugging. They may need to connect to Azure for certain connectors and services, but there is that local debugging capabilities available for Logic App Standard and Function Apps. And that's one of the nice things about that. It's really easy to do that. And it is one of the things, and I think, watch this space. I think the guys at a lot of the product groups have heard that local is important. And there's some changes coming along for some of the other services that are near and dear to our integration hearts, that are going to have the ability to have local debugging support. So that, and I mean, I argue with my developers that how many times are you developing that you're not connected to the internet? And I have one that he does live kind of remote, so he does a little bit of work when he's offline. But most of them, I mean, I'm sitting pretty much connected to the internet all the time. And now that Elon's Starlink is starting to roll out to the rest of Australia, I'll be able to do my trip around Australia and I'll be connected the whole time with a nice little satellite dish.
And hope it's not too cloudy.
Yeah, well, the clouds aren't usually the problem. It's the storms and things, but
Yeah.
I'm still, it's still better than a very, very sorry 3G connection. So,
yeah, and I think Bill, the point there is too that logic, in particular, Logic App Standard is such a significant change, I think, compared to consumption, because we've got the option to run standard, in many different places, including things like containers. And so being able to share your Logic App projects across Logic App or standard hosting makes, is a real game changer, particularly for, yourself, like Six Pivot and things, where there's service, consulting companies and the like, and developing product. You can have many projects in that one standard container. One standard Logic App server. So I think
I've just gone back and updated those.
I saw that, and so I just think consumption, yes, it's great for, I'm just going to jump in and I'm going to dabble or whatever. But as soon as you want to do something serious and you're building a business about it, in my eyes, the standard being a couple of $100 to start off with a month is just a no-brainer.
Yep. And I think we'll see a little bit more of that as we start talking about deployment also. I've got a little bit down here on deployment. And I think that if I can keep from having to munge that JSON from the consumption Logic app to deploy it, I will be a happy person. So yeah, that whole idea of being able to have those at different places, and that's one of the things I missed earlier, was that ability to put them in containers and run them.
Yeah.
And if you have a customer that's going seriously multi-cloud, you can run your Logic apps in a container on AWS.
Yeah.
So,
or in a variety of different places.
Yeah, or on-prem at that too. But it's funny because most of the customers that were interested in the on-prem stuff only had VMware. They didn't have any kind of container infrastructure. So that was going to be more of a challenge to get containers running in their infrastructure than it was to get the Logic app running in a container. So, but that's one of the issues that we have. There are some, moving on to kind of the next things here. There are the differences in the actions and triggers that are supported. So there are, with the Logic app consumption, it pretty much supports all of the actions and triggers that are out there. The ISE supports a subset of that. The Logic app standard supports natively a subset of those actions and triggers, but you can call out to Azure and use those other ones. And the kind of ones. Yeah, so basically it's things like, if I'm going to go out to Dropbox, or I'm going to go out to OneDrive, or I'm going to go out to Exchange, or the mail and things like that, it doesn't make sense for that to be inside of a Logic app standard as a native connector, because if I'm running in a container inside of an isolated environment, I can't call off to it anyway. It's not going to go anywhere. I've got to have something based in the cloud that's going to work on that. So there are, and that is one of the things you do have to take into consideration. So if you do start using those managed triggers and actions, you do still pay those per action, per trigger charges. And so you may not, your standard Logic apps may not get away from all of that consumption-based billing, but it gets rid of a lot of it, because, as we'll talk about next, around polling, function apps, they pretty much support the built-in triggers and things like that for most of the stock services like blob storage, service bus, things like that. So that's kind of part of the function app. The rest of it's going to be code, and it's going to be going out to Azure or wherever you need to go to do that. The next thing kind of fits in with this is polling. So if you think about, and I'm the world's worst because I will do almost anything to keep from polling a SQL Server database. Because even with BizTalk, polling was expensive. Not in terms of what it cost you, but in CPU and all of the stuff that was around it. So with Logic Apps consumption, all of those services that are easy to use. So like I want to wait for a blob to be created in a storage account, and I want to check every minute if that blob has been created. It's not obvious that I'm getting charged every second that I check for that blob. And if I only have one Logic app and it runs all day long, and the actions cost me what 0.0001 of a cent, I won't notice it. But if all of a sudden I clone that Logic app 100 times and I'm checking for 100 different blobs, I'm going to start noticing that polling happening. And I'm going to start noticing that what I call background hum of that polling activity. Then,
yep. Sorry, Bill, you go.
Yeah, and so that's why one of the things that Microsoft came up with was Event Grid. So Event Grid gave us the ability to set a event trigger on a storage account, so that only when a blob was created or updated, an event would be sent to our Logic app. And that is an HTTP endpoint, so that only time that Logic app woke up to do anything was when it got an HTTP request.
Yeah, so, which the way it should be.
Yes. And the thing is that in the consumption based, it's not much, but it's one check every time you hit that interval. And the way you kind of get that idea is anytime that somebody asks you how often you want to check. So when you configure your storage, it says, how often do you want to check? Anytime you've got that question, you're polling. I don't care what they say, you're polling. And then the big difference with the Logic App Standard is you've got that app service plan there running all the time. So you're paying for that 24/7. So if you're polling 1,000 storage accounts for a blob to be created, you're not going to change your pricing because you've got that app service plan you're paying for. I guess when you will hit a threshold where if you got 10,000, that you're going to have to go up and scale up your app service plan to a bigger app service plan so that you're not consuming all the CPU just polling things.
Mm-hmm. That's what I was going to say. That's like you still eating. It is polling in Logic Apps Standard becomes as costly as polling in BizTalk server versus like as costly as in Logic Apps consumption, right? So it's costing you the cycles that you could be using for other stuff.
Yeah.
But the other thing to take in consideration here, just while you're talking about Logic Apps Standard, just because the text might confuse some people, all of the service providers, so all the built-in connectors, the ones that are running against the app service plan, is going to be free of charge, in quotes, is going to be paid by the cycles of the app service plan. But if you're still getting like a Dropbox or some of those other ones that you'd be using an Azure connector, just like on the previous one, you're still going to be paying for that. So it's important to understand that every time that you use an Azure connector, you're paying for the connection action or executions like you're paying for consumption.
So and that's a point I wanted to just raise here too, Wagner in particular. The connector that I came across was the data gateway, or the one that allows you to, using SQL, for example, a data connector, to be able to connect to an on-premises database or a database in another region. That was a managed connector as opposed to the native ones.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
I just thought it was surprising that, obviously the native one is kind of more of a straightforward database connector, whereas the hybrid one had to be managed. And I'm just curious as to, what governs what's managed and what's not.
So what we call in managed connectors or Azure connectors is the ones that are when you go into Logic Apps Standard, you're going to be seeing two tabs, and one is the built-in connectors, the other one is the Azure connectors, right? Everything that we call in Azure connectors are those still be creating as a connection in Azure, and then because of that, the only way for them to go on-prem is using on-premise data gateway. But the only reason why you're seeing that right now, if you're talking about SQL Server specifically, is because the connector is still catching up on the full parity with the Azure connector. If you look at like last week or the week before, you probably saw that the SQL Server connector, for example, added a whole raft of the new features. Like I actually have it open here. Things like the executing stored procedures that was not there before, and some of the other things. But the reason why we don't have the trigger on the Azure on the Service Bus connector yet is exactly because we're working together with the SQL team to make sure that when that trigger is there, is not a polling trigger. It's more based on an event. Right? So the connectors, the built-in connectors are going to be evolving all the time, getting like more and more features until they are at the same level of features as the consumption ones.
Yeah, so and just playing, I suppose, asking the question on everyone's mind, where do we see that kind of information, if possible, in sort of public land? Because let's say you're evaluating Logic Apps, as I find a lot of my customers at the moment are, and what's the right hosting model, what's the plan? So they're doing a whole cost analysis. And sorry, Bill, you've got a great demo to get on with.
No, I just wanted to show you. I wanted to show you one of the things that I always go by. And hold on a second. I wanted to show you what I go by when I'm building my Logic Apps to know kind of what you're going to be up for in terms of cost. So basically, if you go into the designer, and this comes up in a second, and you go here and you add an action, and those built-in ones are the ones that you're going to have that run in your app service plan. Anything that shows up in this Azure, except it doesn't in mine at the moment, it's not connected, but anything that shows up in that Azure one is the ones that you're going to have to be paying that extra consumption charge around. And I mean, I understand it's nice and easy at design time, but when you're doing the layout or you're doing the design documentation and stuff for a client, it's not near as clear what that looks like.
Yeah, and one of the things that we planning to work on is improving that documentation at the connector level to give you a little bit more of that information.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And I think even You know, because one of the things I really enjoy about the Logic Apps arena here is the pace that it moves. You know, the updates, the way that you update all the regions in the world. You know, they're near at the same time, there and thereabouts. You know, it's great, because if we're going to base innovative technology solutions on technology pieces, then we want them to evolve as the market dictates. So, you know, that always carries a huge weight in my mind and my considerations. It's just, you know, obviously there's a point where you come down to how much is this thing going to cost me? And you're looking at, as you say, Bill, the managed connectors, the native connectors, or the you know, the Azure based. And so we're working out predictive pricing and those sorts of things. If I run this, you know, as you say, polling or triggering or whatever, and okay, it's going to cost us X. And that's where, and you made a really good point about you're on a standard, but then you're using some of these other managed connectors, so they're going to bump it up a little bit more. So that's, you know, that's going to influence how often you go to Twitter, for example, and poll that for some critical information coming in to drive your solution. And sure enough, in one instance, it's all right, but if you're building an integration business and you're going to be doing this across 100, then it starts to add up, 100 every second, or you go, well, hold on, let's do it every 10 minutes. And that's a different design where, you know, Wagner, if coming back to your point, if we had, you know, whatever is shareable to kind of go, hey guys, this is what's happening on, you know, these connectors roadmaps, that would be really helpful.
That is something that you that we started to do more and more. I actually have a link for that. Just let me find here, because we're trying to give that information more and more. So if you go to aka.ms/logicapps connectors roadmap, I'll put it on the private chat, and you can actually put it as a comment.
Yeah, put it on the private chat, and then I'll push it out as a comment.
Yeah.
So
that roadmap there is trying to give you exactly that kind of information, where and when the new connectors are coming, and we updating that every time that we've been making changes or giving some kind of timeline for when the connectors are going to be available.
Yep. Okay, guys, we need to move on a little bit so that we can get through the rest of mine. So one of the other things is that I take into consideration is that with the consumption-based Logic app, they each one show up in Azure as a different deployment, where Logic App Standard and Function Apps, you can have many Logic Apps or Function Apps inside of one project. And it's much easier to call between those inside of one project. It's a little bit harder to call out to consumption ones from a standard, as we found. But a lot of times I have been doing that via API management anyway. Now, I'm going to leave this parameter one for till the end, because I've got a couple of demos around this. So one of the other things to consider is integration accounts. And this has been, let's see, I guess I've been fairly vocal even from the start about how expensive integration accounts are. And I wanted to know why. I've always wanted to know why, but nobody will tell me. But that's the way it goes. But with the Logic Apps consumption, you need an integration account if you want to do XML schema validation. If you go to standard, they are part of the project and they get deployed as part of the project. You don't need an integration account. For function apps, you either embed them into the function app or you put them in a storage account. Maps, either XSLT or liquid maps with consumption based, you need an integration account. with Logic App Standard, they go in the project the same way as the schemas. So I've got a couple of customers right now using an integration account because they're using Logic App Consumption, where if we convert to standard, they'll be just into the projects, and we won't have to worry about having them in the integration account. We won't have to worry about an integration account. Now, EDI, you need an integration account for consumption, and you need an integration account for standard. So you can't get around that for EDI. And Function Apps really doesn't do EDI. You have to do it via code. Now, this last one is a little bit interesting, is existing BizTalk maps. So you can run those by going into the existing BizTalk map and grabbing the XSLT and basically putting it in your integration account, and then you can run that BizTalk map in your consumption. You can grab that XSLT, put it in your project for your standard, and run it. And in Function Apps, because you've got .NET code there, you can run XSLT, so you can run it via code. The one that's a bugbear for me, because I've got a customer that's got almost all of their maps have got helpers with them that are calling off the .NET code, I don't have a choice. I have to use a Function app to run that XSLT map with a helper. Justin Wu.
The integration account supports that, but there is like a not natively, right? You needed to break down the map in order for you to do this.
I was going to say that actually there is a solution for that. But it's painful because you'd have to take all your external functions and deploy them, or your external helpers and deploy them as functions, and then they will work.
Okay.
Also, I just wanted to point out one caveat. You said that with Logic App Standard, it supports the existing BizTalk maps. The one thing is that your almost all of your functoids will not work out of the box in Logic App Standard, and the reason for that is you don't have the .NET framework available to run them because they're all implemented with C# script.
Okay. Yep. Well. Okay. Yep. I understand. So yeah, I've been doing it mostly. Justin Wu did a sample function app to run the BizTalk maps, and I've been using that for most of my BizTalk map based maps. So yeah, that would it would be nice to have a good solution for that.
Yeah, working on some of that, but it's early days.
Yeah. So the last thing I kind of want to that's on this table that we started, and again, if you got other things that you want to know about, just hit our Twitter account, Integration Down Under, and post a message or send a message to that, and we can look at doing this for one of the subsequent talks and things like that. The next one I want to talk about is parameters. How many people have tried to do dynamic parameters in Logic Apps Consumption? Mm-hmm. Munging the JSON to be able to change the parameter value when you deploy it is painful. It's also prone to the fact that, okay, if I make a change to the Logic App, I want to copy it out to my ARM template to deploy it or my Bicep template to deploy it. I've just wrote over my parameter values and things like that. So it is harder to do that. And Logic App Standard, because it runs in an app service plan very similar to the Function app, you can use app settings. And you can also use app config, and you can use key vault. And I meant to update this before the talk tonight, is that I've actually proved that you can do those guys for Logic App Standard also. And so basically it gives you the ability to be able to use app config directly and key vault directly from your Logic App Standard. So I'm going to quickly hop to my demo. I've got some demo code here that Let's see, the first one is my consumption-based logic app. And if we edit that, what I have to do to get something from app configuration. So if you're not familiar with app configuration, there is a service called app configuration, and you have a configuration explorer. And in this one, I've got a test value, and I don't have a label on it, but I could have a label for dev, test, UAT, and prod. So I could have multiple values here. So I could add a value and be 4, 5, 6, 7, and I put a label on it of dev. And that basically lets me see those values. In my logic app, consumption based, I get that via an HTTP call. I call off to my app configuration. I give it the name of the value I want. And in this particular case, I didn't give it a label, but I could. And then I'm using managed identity of my logic app to access my app config. And in the access control here, and I look at the role assignments, you'll see that my demo BC logic app is got app configuration data reader based on its managed identity. So if I run that trigger, and we just wait for that to run, and then we go in here, we can see that the test value, where is the, okay, that didn't, I know why. That's not the right one of those calls. Sorry about that. There is a call that gets the actual value. That's doing a list of the keys that are out there. I put this together in a little bit of a hurry. But you can do it through this and get the keys, and basically look at that. And that's the way you do it through a consumption based. If we look at a standard logic app, and this is basically, I'll go here real quick, and it's this logic app here that we looked at earlier. There's a initialized variable that goes and initializes value based on a parameter called test value. And if we look at our parameters here, we'll see that we have test value and a couple other ones. What we want to see is that then we go to our parameters.json, and we have those values, and it says to go use the app settings. So if we go into our logic app standard and go back to our workflow and go here to the configuration, this is just like you would for your apps, your app services or your functions or any of those things. You have that, I have that test value in here, and I'm using one of the preview features. So if I go here and I say, show my values, that test value is using one of the new features. And basically it's using the @Microsoft.app configuration endpoint equals and key value equals, or key equals. And what that does is it will go out and read that value out of app configuration and present it to your application as the configuration variable test value. So if we go into our workflow here, into test XML, and we run the trigger and go look at, it's going to fail because it doesn't do the XML validation correctly because I didn't send the payload. But if we look here at the execution, come on. Let's just for the time being go back to the first one. Oh, they're all taken. Okay, Wagner, why is it taking so long to bring up the history?
It's not because of the you running
There.
and it's still.
Yeah. Okay, so if you look at that initialized variable now, you'll see that it's got a value of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it actually pulled that into the configuration of the app service plan, and it pulled it in when I asked for it as a parameter because of the connection between the parameter and the app settings. You do have to.
Bill,
yes.
Bill, one of the things I just wanted to add to this is that
Yep.
what I've found is that if in the standard model, if I go to the browser and using the browser base to build some logic apps and supply some parameters, and
Yep.
then inadvertently someone goes and fires up Visual Studio VS Code and has a project, when you push, I find that it overwrites the parameters.
Yep.
That were originally there.
Yeah, you need to pull them down and put them into the parameters.json first. Yeah, that is it is a trick for new players. Because if you define them here, it doesn't get pulled into the Visual Studio project when it creates. The other thing that you got to keep in mind is if you've changed them in app configuration, they won't get updated in here until you restart the app. So you would have to restart the app to get the new value in app configuration. The other way to do it is with the function app, and the function app has a way of doing it through code. And basically you just go in there and get the environment variable test value and puts it into that test value. This one is actually working the same way. In functions, there's also a way to actually connect to app config and to actually set a watcher on app config. So when the value changes in app config, the function reloads it. So the code base that you can do in functions is a lot more full featured in terms of that when values change. But again, if you were to run that, it goes out and does the same sort of thing. And so you'll see here, there's my test value equals 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that was just a little bit of a demo around how you do parameters in the different versions of the logic app and the function app, just to give you a little bit of the differences. I like the standards from the developer point of view because that I don't have to munge that JSON that is in the logic app consumption. So many times I've done it and then I've overwritten it and didn't have a copy of it to save. And so it made things a little bit painful to have to go back to my source repository, pull the last commit out of Git and cut and paste that back into my JSON. So that's pretty much what I wanted to cover. We've pretty much used the hour. And again, this is designed to kind of get that talk started. I don't see any questions in that section. I'll bring the guys back also. There we go. There's everybody back. And again, I want to thank everybody for hopping on to this call. And again, I realize a lot of people will pick this up from the YouTube stream. And again, that's the whole idea behind making sure that this gets kept on YouTube, that people can pick it up and look at it. So hopefully we will, we've got a couple of topics that we're looking at for the October meeting. So as soon as I get one of those lined up, we will put that information out on the Integration Down Under website. And that's the place where you can find all of the previous talks also. Again, I think I've just been doing a bunch of BizTalk work, and I've pretty much had my fill of BizTalk work. I'm going back to Azure Integration. And I'm looking forward to this whole working with mostly probably Logic App Standard, but there will be a mix of Logic App consumption. There'll be a mix of function apps. I'm a real fan of function apps. I like a lot of the stuff that you can do with function apps, a lot of stuff with API management and things like that. So again, reply to our Twitter, Integration Down Under, send us a message, and basically what kind of topics you'd like to see, anything, any questions you have, and things like that. So that would be helpful. So again, there's my details. Feel free to reach out to me. And again, the Integration Down Under webcast, or the Twitter address, you can reach out to on that.
Bill, before we head off, I do have one question about that last demo.
Yep.
And it's really the missing piece, or the final piece of the puzzle, and that is, we've built these amazing and beautiful looking Logic apps and very easy to follow. Is there a documenter tool like BizTalk Documenter where we could point it as a BizTalk server and go generate me a Word doc or a PDF or a CHM file and do some magic in there? Because that would be awesome.
It would be. My documenter tool of choice turns out to be Snagit.
Yeah. Like when it's this big, and what are you doing? Collapsing scopes on scopes?
You go to about 25% on your browser, and you get as much as you can in, and
but
you hope somebody's
a breeze. You can scroll. So
yeah. And also you hope that whoever's looking at it's got a 25 or at least about a 40-inch monitor, so they can actually see it in a reasonable. So yeah, exactly. I mean, that is one of the things that I've struggled with some of my clients, because I like to give them information about the Logic apps and everything that we've delivered, and it tends to be one of those things that we don't have a good way of doing that, and I'm not sure. The problem is the way they did the BizTalk Documenter, they actually hooked into the orchestration debugger to get the image of the orchestration. And I don't think there's anything that we can hook into to display or create an image of the Logic app. Because they found a really sneaky way to get that image of the orchestration by going through the orchestration debugger to get that image. So that's the problem. I
remember that.
Yeah. So it's a Wagner question that says, okay, how do we document these Logic apps?
Because I mean, if
I'm taking my PM hat off.
So it's a good question. But the thing is,
presents the designer, right?
Yeah.
So one thing that is simpler compared to the problem that we have in BizTalk, if you think about it, is the whole thing is a graph, right? So if someone was trying to do that as an open source or as a component, like following the graph would be simpler than what we had there. We might not have the same images or exactly the same fidelity, but would be a place. There is other things that I worry about on that one. Is like, what is the API, what is the connections, and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, well, I mean, it goes back to the same thing. Is if you look at a function app, there is no visual. It's just code.
Mm.
But
So
even on a function app, it would like, what is the list of functions that you have?
Yeah.
What is the list of the bindings? Right on the logic apps, what is the list of logic apps? What's the list of connections? So none of those has something that creates like a document out of that, like Beanstalk Documenter used to do. But even on Beanstalk Documenter, it was an effort outside of the team to get that.
Yeah.
Mm.
So
it'd just be nice to somehow harness, let's say, what VS Code Designer is doing. Because understand, if we're following a graph going all the way through, today it's going to be, there's a concerted effort to make it on parity with what's on offer. But then over time, you're going to get differences. Maybe there's new actions or shapes or new properties. And how do, it's an ongoing thing to keep it all in sync, where the designer is doing it all day, every day.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
Serverless 360, the product by Kavai, does generate documentation, by the way, for all of that stuff, but it doesn't get the image though of the logic that's what you're after.
Yeah. So okay, thanks everyone for tuning in. And I really enjoyed the chat because it's nice to actually get interaction with the other guys and discuss this, because I planned this talk a while ago, and it's one of those things that it really starts the discussion. It doesn't finish the discussion. It starts the discussion more than anything. So thanks everyone for attending, and we will see you next month.
See you all.